Tom, Professor of International Business and Associate Director of the David Lamb Center for International Communication. Our speaker this afternoon is Dr. Jen Walls, a man who needs no introduction since virtually all of you here know him. Dr. Walls is Professor Emeritus at Simon Fraser University and retired this past August as Founding Director of the David Lamb Center. Jen is a master, and I don't use the word lightly to describe anyone. In fact, I don't think I've ever used it to describe anybody before. Jen is a master of Chinese language and culture, in a long and distinguished career at the three leading universities in British Columbia, Simon Fraser University, University of British Columbia, and University of Victoria. Dr. Walls continues to do what he loves and does very well in developing a series of online Chinese language courses and writing a book on using Chinese. Today, Jen will talk about wit and humor in Chinese television commercials. Jen?
Thanks, Rosie. After putting you through all of the delay and the trouble of moving, I'm going to be devastated if you're not happy with my presentation. First of all, let me remind you that I'm not a specialist in business and management. If I'm a specialist in anything, it would be cross-cultural communication, language and cross-cultural communication. Okay, but a lot of what I spend most of my time worrying about and losing sleep over is quite useful for people who are interested in or who are involved in or who are applying cross-cultural communication for management, business and management purposes. So what I'd like to do is to go through, first of all, an outline of what I'm going to be talking about. This way, if I depart from the outline, you can remind me and I'll get back to it, because I know you all have other things to do this afternoon, and I'm going to try to get you out of here before 3:30. In fact, ideally to finish by around 3, so that you'll have time for discussion. Give me a chance to defend myself if I've said anything that flies in the face of your own experience. So I'd like to say a few words about wit and humor. What's the difference? And I'll answer this question. Are you implying that Chinese have a sense of humor? It must be rather different from ours, right? Are TV commercials important in China, particularly today? Different types of TV commercial, a brief overview of the different types of humor, how humor works in support of a project. That's what this is all about. And some sample commercials from television broadcasts. I have about a half a dozen of them we'll look at. Fortunately, they're so expensive. National television commercial time is so expensive that they're all very short. Very seldom exceed 30 seconds. Take a quick look at sources and then those examples. Okay, so do Chinese have a sense of humor? Yes, the answer, of course, is yes. The earliest surviving poem in the Chinese language, it's called Jinangge, means living in peace and comfort. It's an anonymous poem, but it says, 日出而作，日入而息，左景而饮，耕田而食，地利与我何有哉? Sunrise, I go to work. Sunset, I rest my feet. I dig a well so I can drink. I plow the field so I can eat. To me, the power of the king doesn't mean a thing. And that's clearly a clear use of irony, because there's a build-up for something majestic. To me, the power of the king. And then the letdown doesn't mean a thing, right? It's satirical humor, and it's no accident that the earliest verse that we have extant in Chinese history is in fact an example of satirical humor. In fact, the world's oldest anthology of jokes comes from China. It's the Xiaolin, or the Forest of Laughter, attributed to Han Dan Chun in the later Han period, 2nd century A.D. And it's the equivalent to this guy walks into a tea house, comes up to a waiter and says, you know, how many times have you heard English jokes? The guy walks into a bar, comes up to the bartender and says, well, you have all of those in Chinese humor. Let me give you one more example from very, very early on. This goes all the way back to the, say, the 3rd century BC. The 3rd century BC. There's an aspiring zithern player, a musician who plays the zithern, the qin, and he goes into the market town, and he finds a table. He puts his qin out on that table, and he starts performing on the qin. Well, the people who come to the market have come there to buy and sell goods, right? They're not all that interested, and it's a, you know, a Chinese market is a bustling place. They call it 闹市. It's a bustling market, right? And then nobody pays attention. No, connoisseurs of good music, they don't go to the market, and so apparently nobody paid any attention to him. But he kept on playing and playing. There was one person there, though, who was sitting just near him and was facing him all along. And eventually, sunset came, the market closed down, and everybody left and went home, except this one person who was sitting there, rapt by this performance, apparently. And the musician eventually said, "Sir, I think I've met my zhiyin, someone who really understands my music," which is a Chinese term for saying a soulmate, because you have sat here all through my performance, and obviously you're my zhiyin, my one who knows my music, my soulmate. And the guy says, I'm sorry, but that's my table that you're using for that. This goes all the way back to 3rd century BC, which is another terrific example of a comical letdown at the end. Well, what are some of the components of humor? Rowan Atkinson, whom most of us know as Mr. Bean, you've watched Mr. Bean on television, he had a lecture. This lecture has been published. It's called Funny Business. He explains that an object or a person can become funny in any one of 3 different ways. There's just 3 ways you need to keep in mind. 1, by being in an unusual place. In fact, the early joke that I just told you, it would be an undesirable, unusual place for the musician, for example. By behaving in an unusual way. Now, behaving in an unusual way could mean saying something that one would not anticipate, or wearing something that one would not anticipate would be worn, should be worn in an environment like this. So it could be behavior, it could be clothing, it could be speech, but behaving in an unusual way. And the third is by being the wrong size. And of course, humor almost always involves exaggeration. So it's either exaggerated expectation or a normal expectation, but an exaggerated reality. Humor almost always involves exaggeration. But he says being the wrong size.
John, would you say that that's cross-cultural?
I'm sorry?
Would you say that that's cross-cultural?
Oh, no, I would say that that is innately human. That is universal. It's universal. I mean, all the jokes, I've tried to understand jokes in different language cultural sources, and I think these 3 always apply. Most Chinese people, when they see this formula that I've just given you from Rowan Atkinson, from Mr. Bean, they would immediately think of a traditional Chinese proverbial expression: the right time, the right place, the right people. 天时地利人和. As soon as you hear those 3 from Rowan Atkinson, immediately, if you're Chinese, you're going to think of this. 天时 means the natural time, the right time. 地利, the location is auspicious, a good location. And 人和, and the people match. The people are together. But then, to achieve Rowan Atkinson's wrong element, you'd have to negate it. You'd say the wrong time for such behavior. 天不时, the wrong place for such behavior. 地不利, and the wrong people for such an audience. 人不和. So any one of these 3 can create humor, assuming that there's no serious injury or death involved, because the only thing that distinguishes humor from tragedy, comedy from tragedy, is the ultimate effect of what goes wrong. If it is fatal or seriously debilitating, it's going to be seen as tragic. If it could be possibly but isn't, this feeling makes it funny, comes out funny. The first post-cultural revolution newspaper ad came out in Shanghai, January the 4th, 1979. So 1978, they first started announcing that they were getting serious about reforms in China. Early 1979, the first post-cultural revolution newspaper advertisement in China appeared in the Tianjin Shibao, the Tianjin Daily. You can still find this on tianjindaily.com.cn. Toothpaste, Lantian, Blue Sky toothpaste, still produced in Tianjin by that group. Then less than a month after the toothpaste ad was published, on January the 28th, China's first television commercial screened on Shanghai TV. Notice Shanghai is sort of avant-garde in the commercialization of almost anything in China. It was advertising a type of ginseng wine. And then in the same year, it only took 2 months, less than 2 months in the same year, radio commercials started airing in Shanghai People's Radio, and then a week later, TV commercial by a foreign company, Rado Watches, was broadcast on Shanghai, and so on. And then by April, the People's Daily published its first advertisement for the Chongqing Geological Instrument Factory, and then that opened the floodgates. Once the Renmin Zhibao, the People's Daily, does something, then you know that becomes the signal that this is okay. And so the floodgates opened, and the rest has been history. So, are they, hello, QuickTime and a decompressor are needed to see this picture. That's why I wanted to do it originally on my Mac PowerBook, which I have with me. But you can see this later. All I'm saying is that by 2010, the year that the Olympics will take place in Beijing, they are anticipating there will be 100 million Chinese families hooked up to satellite TV. China has already put a broadcasting satellite in orbit, and it is pretty well understood that most of China now has access to cable TV, cable internet, but they're also going to have 100 million homes are going to have their own satellite cables. Do the multinationals consider Chinese television commercial market to be important? Well, Ad Age China conference will feature McDonald's Mary Dillon. Mary Dillon, the McDonald's Corporation's global chief marketing officer, will give the keynote address at the first Ad Age China branding conference in Shanghai on December 8th. That's this year. Other speakers are going to be from Procter & Gamble, PepsiCo, Motorola, Volkswagen, Visa, Adidas. They're treating China seriously in terms of advertising targets. Well, what are some of the traditional Chinese consumer values then that are going to be addressed by TV ads and particularly humor? These are the traditional values according to an interesting study, and you can have access to this when this presentation goes up on the forum webpage. I have a little bibliography at the end. The traditional values: family, of course, health, tradition, patriotism, filial piety, and education. These are the major ones. And this was the presumption before they did their investigation. I'll come to the results of the investigation in a moment. The traditional. Now, the modern Chinese consumer values are modernity, in other words, symbols of modernization, symbols of modernity, beauty and youth, pleasure, success or status, materialism, that is the appreciation or almost worship of material wealth on its own, and environmentalism. And one other utilitarian values, and that is quality or effectiveness. The excellence, durability, or effectiveness of the product will be emphasized. You'll find all of this in Zhang and Harwood's article, Modernization and Tradition in the Age of Globalization, Cultural Values in Chinese Television. What are the results of their study? They found that amongst the traditional values, the first three, family, health, and tradition, have a very significant presence amongst commercial values in Chinese television today. Amongst modern values, you find modernity, beauty and youth, pleasure, success and status. All of these have, I would say, significant, rather high percentages. More of them in the modern values than in the traditional values. You have only three or so, about three significant values from the traditional values list left. And of course, utilitarian, because equality and utilitarian values, because the Chinese always have been. Let's go all the way back to the earliest known Chinese verse. Sunrise, I go to work. Sunset, I rest my feet, and so on. The practicalities of life are still probably that's the highest single percentage, of all of the values that appear in the commercials. So what are the types of TV commercial then? Let's make a brief overview of these. Very common one, product testimonial by a prestigious person. We saw one in the very first introductory slide there, Yao Wei. This is not a Chinese commercial, but we're familiar with it, Yao Wei and the little person, wherein Yao Wei pulls out, reaches up without even standing up, and pulls down out of the overhead rack, pulls down his 12-inch Macintosh Power book, opens it up and starts typing, and the little guy next to him, not to be intimidated, hops down off the seat, pulls out his 17-inch Macintosh Power book and puts it on his lap, and he's looking sort of at Yao Wei, and Yao Wei is sort of looking at him, and they're smiling at each other. Both of them know that what they have in common is the quality, the utilitarian purpose, value, and so forth of the Macintosh. But when it's Yao Wei who's involved, immediately you're not going to forget that product. Product association with an attractive, desirable person. I don't have to remind anybody who watches television of the accepted notion that if you can have either a very beautiful person or a very important person saying this product is good, or I use this product, whether it's 007, what's his face? Not the brand new one, but the previous one before. I'm sorry? Pierce Brosnan, thank you. Pierce Brosnan sporting a particular wristwatch, which you can see if you open up most glossy magazines or whatever. The association with an attractive or desirable person it's one of the most common methods of advertising your product. Empirical evidence of product effectiveness. Empirical evidence. That is, how many times have you heard in a commercial, laboratory tests? Laboratory tests have demonstrated that, blah, blah, blah. Well, you know, when I hear of empirical evidence or demonstration of product effectiveness, where you have someone who's trying to convince you of the virtues of this particular vacuum cleaner as opposed to others, and they just throw a bunch of stuff on the floor, very often on the rug of an unsuspecting housewife, which again, this brings humor into the commercial, and then uses that vacuum cleaner to suck up everything that had been spilled on the rug. This is demonstration. It's not empirical evidence because it's not laboratory controlled and everything, but it's seen as a demonstration of product effectiveness. I've been sort of skeptical about these product testimonials by a prestigious person, starting with this. Ever since in my childhood, I remembered I think the statistic was 3 out of 4 doctors consulted smoked Camels. This is in my childhood. That tells you how far back I go. Demonstrations of product effectiveness, okay, we had. Then demonstration of superiority over competing products, okay? Another very common method of advertising in television commercials. You have a demonstration before your own eyes where you have, you put the same stain on two white shirts, and you put one in a washing machine that has Tide, and you put another one in a washing machine that has brand X. And then time flies fast and pull them out, and one of them is a lot cleaner than the others. Hopefully Tide in that case. But how does humor function in sport? We'll use previously listed components of humor, but in an unexpected manner. There will be you will not anticipate, in an effective, good commercial, you will not be able to anticipate how the product being advertised will acquire positive value and desirability as a byproduct. And I will suggest another way of spelling byproduct here, of the humorous episode. It is a byproduct rather than the focus of the commercial. If you put the focus of the commercial on that product, that's crass. You might as well just come out and say, buy this, it's better. You don't do that. In an effective commercial, you will find out toward the end that this, in fact, was an integral part of this unforgettable little episode, with the result that viewers will remember the episode and the product will benefit by pleasant association, not by mere assertion. I have a couple of background and reading notes here. You'll find that article by Zheng Hong and John Schweitzer in the Journal of Advertising Research, volume 36, 1996. And in there, Zheng and Schweitzer content analyzed 1,105 U.S. and Chinese commercials from 1993 and identified 8 cultural values. Anyway, you'll find this an interesting study if you want to look at empirical research that has been done on this subject. And Paul Speck published in the Current Issues and Research in Advertising, issue 13, Humorous Message Taxonomy, a framework for the study of humor. He identifies incongruity resolution. Okay, so you set up an incongruity, two things that don't belong together, either wrong place, wrong time, wrong size, and then you resolve it at the end. So Mr. Bean's models of the 3 types work if you apply it to the Speck test there. A few illustrations here.
OK， 我不是跟你说嘛，顶多加到3%，哎呦，最多5%，哎呦，你们怎么这么啰嗦啊？一定给我咬住！哎呀，我跟你说，我现在在电梯里面说话跟你们不方便。
He's saying that he's trying to conduct business here. He's saying he says, look, no more than 3%. Blah blah blah. Well, okay, but no more than 5%. And in the meantime, trying to keep the elevator door from closing because it's going to interfere with the reception and the sending of his cell phone. Okay, so the problem which sets this whole thing up is a less than adequate cell phone. Okay, and he's explaining now. And there you realize that the product that is being advertised, China Mobile, will solve that problem. You know, without that unfortunate wrestling with the elevator door, you'll be able to carry out your business on the elevator without looking like a fool or sounding like a fool. Okay. And you notice that this episode, when you start watching it, it has nothing to do with any particular product. All you see is a man having, in a predicament, having trouble and having to behave in an out of the ordinary manner, And it's not until the very end that you realize, aha, there's a solution to this problem. And that solution is a very positive image of the service provider, the cell phone. Okay. Lanchin oral liquid. But you don't know this. You don't know what they're selling. Dry throat? Sore throat? Inflamed throat? Now, if you use this Lanchin oral liquid, notice that thing which is supposed, that ATM is it? That's supposed to be spitting out the dollars. It is not spitting them out. But if you try Lanchin oral liquid, then that little slit, that becomes the mouth, and everything comes out. And then at the very end, okay, Yangzijiang Yaoye Jituan produces Lanchin Kouye. Okay. Again, when you start looking at it, you don't have any idea that it's a commercial, except that it has probably interrupted something else that you were really enjoying watching. Otherwise, you wouldn't know it's a commercial. You have no idea what they're selling. So your curiosity is piqued. Your curiosity is piqued. You follow in every one of these little things, 30 seconds, maximum 30 seconds, has all the elements of a complete story. And to a Chinese, that complete story is qi, cheng, zhuan, he. Qi, an opening. Cheng, a development of that opening. Zhuan, a twist. And he, a reconciliation at the end. And you do all that in 30 seconds. Look at a couple more. Starts out in a typical wine and cheese reception, and you have a nice-looking young man walking in almost like, again, I can see Pierce Brosnan or somebody walking into a situation like that and very casually taking something off of the serving tray. And then comes up someone else wants to toast to Peng Beizi, right? And then he reaches it up, and in fact, it's a baby bottle with a nipple on it, and he raises it up because, why? Because this person is not served like a fully functioning adult by his credit card. And if he were to switch to 真正的信用卡 to a true credit card, then he could behave like an adult, and that baby bottle is switched back to a glass of wine, and he's like an adult. Again, you'll remember, I mean, how many of you will not have nightmares about that, thinking you're picking up a glass of wine and finding out that it's a baby bottle? You'll remember that. And then when you remember it, you will remember the pleasant association with that particular product. Another one, you're not going to have any idea what this is about until very much toward the end. Oh, you're going to paint my room. Not that color. Not that color. Not that color either. No. Okay. This is an interesting example from a couple of perspectives, okay? One, you create a kind of an ingenious, again, it's very much out of place. Where's the incongruity here? Where's the incongruity? babies don't express mature opinions about the paint color just by looking at a sample, do they? Nah, this baby is performing like an adult with a critical capacity that overrides the critical capacity of the father, right? This baby's critical capacity is, or at least this baby has the authority to override the preferences of the father, which is an incongruity. Well, but how is this incongruity resolved so that both are happy? It's resolved by going to Li Bang. Notice the name of this paint company in Chinese, Li Bang. Now, Li Bang is the Mandarin way of pronouncing Nippon, which is 日本. And the name of the paint company is the Japan Paint Company, the Japanese paint company. Now, this is the importance of understanding the history of your market. If you want to sell something widely in China today, don't call it, Japan Paint Company. You don't call it 日本 Paint Company. You come, Li Bang, and they're not gonna know that means 日本, right? But that's not connected with the humor. That's a little bit of the irony, because they're being given a very, very positive, pleasant association about a service that comes from something that if they used its real name, which in Japan it's called Nippon Paint Company, right? But that wouldn't work in China, not yet. It'll take a few more years before you can simply call something the Japan whatever and then expect it to sell really well in China. Now, when I talk about China and the cultural values, television cultural values, I'm not only talking about the PRC, the People's Republic of China. I'm talking about all the manifestations of Chineseness in Chinese cultures wherever, pretty much wherever they may be. And I want to give you a couple of examples here. This one comes from, I think this one comes from Taiwan. Let's take a look. Question number 9. What is the answer? 陈兆明. What happened to the student? Do you ever feel small? You feel really small after you give the wrong answer to something, or you say something stupid, or you can't answer? Well, you demonstrate that through the marvels of digitized technology, and the student really feels very small. The apple polishing student, I blew it. So basically, they're advertising, but you don't find this out until the very last, 3 seconds of this commercial. You're talking about the President brand fruit juice, which has all of the vitamins that you need to nourish your brain, which presumably will allow you to answer questions like the teacher just asked. And it is that byproduct, B-U-Y-product, that byproduct of the commercial which makes these things successful. The last example I'd like to give you is, again, it's from Taiwan, but it takes place in Shanghai. And this is really cute. Okay, we have a Taiwan姑娘, a young lady from Taiwan who is pursuing her dreams, and she's traveling in China. She's in Shanghai. She's walking around on the Bund, Shanghai Waitan, and she's opened up, probably looking for the short message service or something, and she's going to take a picture of the Pearl of the Orient TV tower or something, and she backs into a young man. And surprise, and of course the telephone flies up, the cellular flies up and lands in this guy's hand. 一路上的发现 your discoveries on the road. She thanks him, and then she secretly takes a picture of him with her camera cell phone. And you can an amorous a 3-minute amorous encounter. A 3-minute amorous encounter. And you can take this picture that you take and you can immediately send it, okay, via your satellite connection that we invite you to subscribe to your friends back in Taipei, all three of whom are enjoying the visage of your chance encounter on the Bund in Shanghai, and they send her an answer immediately, right? Because they also have the same cell phone service, and their answer is, 把他带回来, bring him back, bring him back. What are the odds? What are the odds? She flags down a taxi, and look who gets out. But that positive association, okay, which you only get at the end, that positive association which comes out not as either a testimonial or the narrative of empirical data from scientific experiments or from a comparison with the competition or whatever, none of those. It just comes out. This is what has made this 3-minute amorous encounter possible. You don't even acknowledge the existence of any competition, because people are going to remember this pleasant episode. Okay. That's my presentation, and I'd be very happy to, who's in charge? Somebody fields questions? I'd be very happy to answer any questions or...
I rarely watch television. Now, do you say that this kind of theme is very rare in North America television commercials?
I'm not saying that it's very rare. I don't study North American television commercials. I study Chinese language and culture and cross-cultural communication. What do people think? Is this kind of commercial in U.S. and Canadian television and major networks? Do you see this sort of thing? I mean, just change the faces from Chinese faces to Lo-Fan faces, and do we see that kind of commercial? I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, and I'm not going to be surprised, because basically my thesis is that humor, the conditions which create humor, are pretty much universal. The principles involved in wit, okay, are usually language specific. And that's why you don't want to get into witty. You don't want to get into the use of wit if you're addressing a different culture. Humor, though, is situational. You can tell if it's the right time or the wrong time. You can tell if it's the right place or the wrong place. You can tell if the people are getting along or not getting along. But the way you can manifest that is either through actions and behavior, through the qi cheng zhuan he, this opening, development, deviation, and closure, or you can do it through very straightforward and translatable dialogue. But you don't want to use wit, because wit is usually language. Wit involves more than one meaning of the same utterance. And that usually is very, very difficult to translate. Very difficult to translate. Chinese call that 老太太打跟头, 难翻. Yeah. So old grandma tries to do a somersault. It's a hard one to turn, to translate. It's hard to translate that. But my answer was, I'll put it this way, I would be very surprised if we didn't find similar commercials. Not identical, because these are uniquely developed for a Chinese audience. But I'd be very much surprised if we didn't find North American parallels, because this kind of humor is essentially human. And it's not culture specific. It's manifestations through different language, through a different geographic environment with its own cultural traditions. Culture is something which is on the superficial layer, which overlays humanity. And inside that, Chinese have always said, 人之初性本善，性相近，习相远. Chinese have always said, in the beginning, people are basically good, but their natures are very similar. And then through different practice, they become different from each other. But it's that practice which overlays their fundamental similarity.
Is this kind of commercial more effective among Chinese teachers than the assertion kind, for example?
Than the assertion kind? I think it depends on the product. If it is, if you're looking at fertilizer, I don't think, the positive association of some fertilizer with something like that is necessary. That's not going to be as good as showing the percentage of crop increase from this experiment with the fertilizer. So it'll depend on the product. Any questions or comments? Sir? Uh-oh. A question from a pro. Scares me.
Fundamental psychological tactic used by advertisers the world over.
Right.
Create the problem.
Right.
We sensitize you to the fact of the problem, but guess what? We have this product.
Insert the solution. Yeah.
That will solve your problem. The first three were like that. The next two had a dimension that I thought was kind of uniquely different. That had to do with being one with you're not an adult, not being treated as an adult.
Uh-huh.
And then the other one with the size sort of thing. Those seem to me to be quite different from what we would typically see in a North American context.
You raise an interesting point, okay, with regard to cultural specificity and Chinese culture. Children in China and in Japan, this is an East Asian thing, I think, are raised with an awareness of the negative aspect of shame, what we will call shame, and that this later grows into losing face in public. The reason why that kid shrank was that in the front of his teacher, who is revered. The teachers are much more revered in a Chinese environment than our teachers are here. I don't know how you feel, Rosalie, but I've never felt revered. Whereas in the West, shame is not a really big deal amongst our kids. It's sin. And it's interesting that there's no direct Chinese translation for sin in their language, culture, and their whole history. They had to adopt one of their existing words, which is actually the word for crime, 罪, for sin. But a religious sin would be a 圣罪, a holy crime, and that sort of thing. But that's not been a part of the bringing up of kids in Chinese culture. It's been shame. So what you really want to avoid more than anything else is shaming yourself, because you're not seen as just an individual. You're seen as a representative of your whole family. So you could be onto something. So I think you may find the undesirability of shame and feeling that you've shrunk in stature in front of your peers would probably appear more often amongst Chinese commercials than it would amongst North American commercials. But I haven't looked in. There's something to ask a student to look into. Do some counting.
Do you think Chinese laugh inside more than Westerners?
More?
Or express the reaction to humor by laughing out loud.
I would say.
To appreciate the humor.
Yeah.
Like, oh, this is cute.
They're less ready to laugh out loud immediately, okay, than the typical or the average Anglo-North American. I say Anglo-North American because I can't speak on behalf of Franco-North Americans or other French-speaking North Americans are this, but Anglo-North Americans will laugh out loud more quickly, more readily, because they're less aware of the social dimension, the social effects of their laughing out loud.
Wouldn't that make humor less enjoyable in the Chinese community? Because it's, people give it to themselves.
I think Chinese, I don't think so, because as I say, the Chinese have been publishing anthologies of jokes. There's a reason for that. They've been publishing these for 2,000 years now, and there's a demand for them, which means there's an appreciation for humor and for laughing, and they call these the xiaolin, it's a forest of jokes or forest of laughter, right? And I think, let me raise one more thing, okay? The Chinese never, before they started translating romantic Western literature into Chinese, they never said, 我爱你, I love you. That is a Western invention, and it's a direct translation into Chinese, which you can do now. It's a direct translation of a very Western notion that it's okay to say, I love you. But, now you can, I guess you can do it. But older Chinese still, I think they get goose flesh when they see that in a movie or they read it in the Chinese translation of a novel. But does that mean that they have less feelings of love? I don't think so. It becomes a discourse matter. I think we have to understand it through understanding the discourse, which is, to me, discourse is the expectation of who will say what to whom in what tone of voice, with what degree of directness or indirectness.
Well, it's more like to Chinese or some Oriental, there's more for private consumption. Humor is for private consumption, whereas Western culture is more of a social thing. It's a vehicle.
Well, I get back to my original explanation, which is what you're calling private consumption. And by the way, I will remind you that there was no word in the Chinese language for private until they started translating Western novels at the end of the 19th century. They had to invent a word, and it's 私隐 still has kind of negative connotation to it. It's not a terribly admirable concept in China, even though it's in the law now. Every individual, and the word for individual has connotations of self-centered, egotistic, and so forth. Every individual now has the right, which means the right and the power. That's a new word from the late 19th century, to privacy, which is 私 is selfish and 隐 is shady. Every self-centered, egotistical item of humanity has a power right to be selfish and shady. There are traditional cultural values built into these things. Now, but what that means is, if you're saying, if Chinese exposed their enjoyment of a good joke more like we do through laughing out loud, then they would get more pleasure out of the jokes. I think that is a culturally conditioned description. I think that is. I know a lot of Chinese who would say that, if when you don't let it out. Who was it? Was it Johnson, in Johnson's dictionary, who said, love is the fart of every heart. 'Tis painful to be kept inside, but when let out, others doth offend. I think you could say the same of love, the same thing about love, maybe. Anyway, or a joke. You want to be careful who you offend. Chinese have been, again, I refer to another piece of conventional Chinese wisdom going all the way back to 400-something BC. Confucius, I think, used this term, 三思而言. Think 3 times before you speak, or 三思而行. Think 3 times before you do anything. And that is why they don't laugh so immediately. But
I think that's also related to the face issue that you were talking about. Because let's say if I laugh and it's a wrong joke or whatever it is, then I lose face. So that's the reason why you think twice before you actually laugh, because then you know that really it's humor.
Think twice or 3 times. Yeah, think 2 or 3 times before you express anything, and you'll be less likely to lose face in front of other people, maybe.
And also that we distinguish between 意会 and 言传. So many of the things you feel, I understand, you understand, but we can't really say it. So a lot of the humor is there. I'm saying something, but not really openly.
Mm-hmm.
But I know how to laugh, and you would say, but we won't say it. And that's really very much part of how we do it.
Yeah. We have this concept in Anglo-North American culture right now of warm, fuzzy feelings. I think the Chinese reaction to a good joke, the immediate one would first be warm, fuzzy, an inner feeling. And then if it's okay, maybe, you've looked around, is anybody going to be offended? Maybe not, then they can laugh out loud. Hi, Mr. Ho.
I think that your observation of the cultural differences are critical for some of us in business. I think all those presentations more oriented towards advertising and consumer products. But I think currently we really have two solitudes between the West and the East. Where the West feels individualism is paramount. But in the East, the reason why laughter doesn't come out first is because you respect the group.
Yeah.
The group right always comes first. And so this dichotomy of the Greek philosophy versus the Confucius philosophy is very much in a clash. And we are also seeing, when you talk about the issues of shame, China without religion really has no ethics support. So James McGregor called China a society of shame. Anything goes as long as you don't get caught. And so I think when using your background and say, well, how do we bridge the West and the East to come to some kind of mutual understanding where we do not need to say, I'm better than you, or you are more stupid than me.
I agree with you. It's not an either-or scenario. It is a both-and scenario, which can be resolved by one piece of proverbial wisdom again. I keep going back to proverbial wisdom because it's so satisfying. You say so much in 4 characters, 4 syllables. The Chinese have it. We don't have it for this one. But to admit that it is possible to view a situation from this angle and interpret it this way, and then once you've interpreted the whole thing, you're going to come up with the same picture, as it is to stand over here and analyze the situation, starting here and then spreading it out, and you're going to end up with the same picture. It's sort of like putting together a jigsaw puzzle. You have the whole picture, the whole landscape in mind. You can start from a different corner and put in all the pieces if you want, but you're going to end up with the same picture. Okay? And in Chinese we call this shu tu tong gui. Different path, same goal. And because Chinese culture has worked, and by the way, I disagree with saying there's no religion in China, because whether you call it familism, that is ancestor worship, that's one thing, or call it Buddhism, which Buddhism is, conquered China 2,000 years ago, and Buddhism is basically it's an ethical system. How do you live with minimal suffering, causing minimal suffering to others and to yourself, and so. But anyway, the point is, it should be in insurance corporations they call it no-fault insurance. You can take a sort of a no-blame approach to envisioning and understanding and appreciating a culture. It is entirely possible to start from this perspective as long as you deal with all the elements of a system that must be dealt with, because every system is a set of separate units joined together for a purpose. Every system is, right? So.
I'm referring to the issue that the last decade, half century, communism has been trying to eliminate religion.
Oh, no. They were designed to eliminate all other religions except Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. That completely took the place of a religion.
And I think that they found that it did not work, and that's why today, I think actually China actually is inviting religion back in a more controlled manner. But I think for people to say there's no freedom of religion in China, I think it's also totally wrong. I think that I think Falun Gong has a special situation because the leaders are determined
That's
Buddhism, Christianity,
Yeah.
whatever it is, as long as you don't go after the Chinese leadership, you're free to worship anybody.
Well, the Middle Eastern tradition of the religions that are primary over here have long ago, 2,000 years ago, decided that it is a virtue to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's. Keep them separate. So it makes me a little bit nervous about what's going on in the U.S. and some parts of Canada right now. A little bit scary. But I agree. I think we agree. Question. Wit and humor both deal with a single phenomenon, and that is that something both is and isn't at the same time. Now, this is what in humor studies we call incongruity. And the resolution of the joke will be in what is incongruity resolution. The resolution of an incongruity will then, that'll be the he in the qi cheng zhuan he, the opening, development, deviation, and then the closure will be the resolution of that incongruity. Let me give, okay, I just tried once to play around with wit in the translations. Oh no, I did it twice. This is easier. I'll give you an easier one. There's a famous line from a poem from the Tang Dynasty, and this was Liu Yuxi, so it would have been in the late 8th or 9th century A.D. And it says, it's sunny in the eastern skies and raining in the west. 道是无情却有情. You could say that it is not fair, but then again, it's fair. Now, in English, fair has two meanings, right? It's not fair, that is unfair. It also means fair weather. So you could translate that piece of wit, because they're talking about, the poet is talking about a heartless lover, whom the girl who's singing the song, the girl hears him coming down the river. He's a heartless lover, and then she adds this zhuan, a twist. It's clear in the eastern skies and raining in the west. You could say it isn't fair, but then again, it's fair. Okay, that's wit. And it's a type of humor, but it's really, really hard to translate. Other kinds of wit are anything that Oscar Wilde ever said. You think of anything that you can recall that Oscar Wilde said, and that's going to be an example of wit, and it'll be very, very difficult to say the same thing in another language. Okay? Humor, however, being situational, almost always translates well. Almost always translates well. One of the, I gave you the one from probably it's like third century BC about the zithern player in the market. Another one from almost 2,000 years ago says there's this husband who has just been given a horrible beating by his wife, and he runs for the bed, and he crawls under the bed, and he hides, and she says, "Come out, you worm. I'm not finished with you yet." And he says, 我不是一家之主吗？我说不出来就不出来. He says, "Am I not the master of this house? If I say I'm not coming out, I'm not coming out." You know? Now that's not wit. That is humor. It's a humorous situation. I guess it says henpecked is a universal phenomenon, and false pride. False pride is a universal phenomenon. So that's, again, that situation is easy to identify.
But is that not wit also? Because the connotation of a master
and at the same time he's reaffirming the masterly status of the wife in front of whom he's afraid to come out of the bed. In a sense, that's witty, yeah. Well, but the main thing for that one is he's not using a word with two meanings. It's an utterance, a whole utterance that has two meanings. That's not a pun, but it's a whole utterance that has two meanings. And that's easier to translate. That's much easier to translate. Puns are almost untranslatable.
Yeah, but Isha, when I think of wit, I think like the examples that you gave, it involves intelligence too. So when you say a person is witty, I mean that's intelligent.
Right. Clever.
I think of,
But it's clever.
yeah.
And
But when I think of some of the commercials that I saw in Hong Kong, which I thought were very humorous, but they cannot be translated at all because it really was a pun on certain words.
Well, but that's wit. That's what I mean by wit.
But it's not intelligence, though. I mean, like the specific.
One of the few things that I remember that my mother taught me when I was a little kid, which reflects an Anglo-North American bias. She says, "Punning, my son, is the lowest form of humor." Punning has not been adequately appreciated, I think, in Anglo-North American society. But it's vastly appreciated in China because it is so easy to pun in Chinese. In Mandarin, there are only 400 syllables in the entire Mandarin language. Only 400 syllables to represent all the complexity of everything in the universe with 400 syllables. Now, only 400 as opposed to 1,400 syllables in English, right? So you have to work harder to pun in English. And if you have to work harder to do it, why bother? I don't know. But it comes naturally. It's like rhyming in poetry. It's very easy to rhyme a poem in Chinese. You have to force it in English almost. So it's much harder to translate a rhymed poem in Chinese into a rhymed poem in English because it's going to be labored in English, where it won't feel like it's being labored in Chinese. Sir?
I just find when it comes down to it, this use of humor in advertising,
Yeah.
it's a really interesting strategy because this use really separates it from other ads, and it associates humor, pretty much makes it more memorable to the audience, and it gives them something more to talk about, and in fact gives that product possibly more to talk about, or more of an image in your mind. And I was just wondering, do you find this to be more evident in Chinese cultural advertising?
Chinese cultural advertising like this is a very recent phenomenon. It's only been growing. It's only been growing in sophistication, I would say. These, I think, are fairly, in a way, they're very common day-to-day situations, but they're also technologically and in terms of imagination and in terms of concealing the goal, which is to heighten the appeal of the product toward the end. That's pretty sophisticated. Doesn't have a very long history. So I think it's fairly novel in China and in Chinese culture, in my opinion. As someone who did his PhD in medieval Chinese poetry, I really don't know what I'm talking about. But this field is so interesting that I cannot resist doing it, and not too many other people are doing it. So I've got to, yes, young lady, and then the young man in the back, man.
Is it signaling a development of sophistication, the way Chinese are thinking of themselves, and maybe a savviness?
Chinese culture has never lacked in sophistication. China has always had the crassest of the crass of folk culture, and they've always had the sophistication beyond your and my mere mortal Lofan's ability to appreciate. They've always had huge sophisticated. But what it indicates is they're widening their embrace of all the elements that they're juggling and bringing into their sophistication and their crassness, because they're also importing Euro-American pop crass. There's a market for it. Everything in China has to do with markets today. Everything. It's there because there's a market for it. Pardon? Well, if you consider 22% of all humanity a big market, yeah. That's why you have the executive vice president or in charge of marketing of McDonald's is going to Shanghai along with the senior executives from PepsiCo and all the other big McDonald's and other big corporations. They're going to a conference in Shanghai on branding and the importance of branding, that sort of thing, because they realize that it's an incredibly huge market, that the ends of the growth are not yet in sight.
Yeah, let's go back to the throat doctor ad and the bank machine that was holding the bills.
Go back. I'm sorry. Say that again.
To the thing for sore throats.
Oh yeah.
The bank machine that was holding
the bank machine, right?
Is
technology, I mean, this is a case, we all have situations, we try to make them humorous, but where photocopiers and telephones and type machines, et cetera, don't function and put us in awkward situations.
Mm-hmm.
And so is there much play on that in Chinese advertising, especially television, on the sort of fallibility of technology?
The fallibility of technology?
Yeah.
Well, I think the
of course, play out something else.
Yeah.
But do they use that as a kind of as a democratizing or leavening?
I don't think you see, or at least I don't see any more of that in China. It's just, as it is here. It's a part of life. I would be very surprised if Murphy's Law and other reasons why things go wrong. I don't know if you're aware of that publication in Volume 2 and so forth of that. I'd be really surprised if that weren't available in Chinese translation, because the Chinese love that kind of, seeing how, why, and when things go wrong. But I think here it's more important is the analogy between the physical structure of a piece of technology, the ATM, the automatic teller technology going wrong, and the analogy with the body, things going wrong here, in this case the throat and the mouth, right? I think that's what comes across first, but you're right, that has always been a concern. That's why Taoism emerged 3,000 years ago as the after 5 o'clock other side of Confucianism. Because Confucianism in China has always been concerned about 9 to 5, making things work. And then you come home from work, you take off your working hat and you put on your skull cap and you meditate on the impossibility of the challenge against entropy, because they've always known that entropy prevails. Yeah, I mean, it's been a part of Chinese culture for 1, 2, 3, about 4,000 years now. Sir?
Have you observed differences in different regions of China? I think northern China, Manchuria, then you have Beijing, central China, and then you get down to the southern barbarian territory, and then Taiwan. And Hong Kong, of course, is another mix. So have you seen any kind of significant differences in terms of their reaction and the way that they go?
To commercials?
Yeah, to commercials and even to Wit and Humour.
To Wit and Humour. They all share, all of the so-called Chinas, the geopolitical manifestations of the Chinas throughout history. And if you look at a historical atlas of China's going back, from the Shang and the Yin and the Zhou and so forth, it just keeps changing shape all the time. And with sometimes the emphasis is on the north, sometimes the emphasis is on the south, sometimes at the beginning of the West, Xi'an is the beginning of Western China, and so on. That huge classical tradition is shared all over China, and the allusions to significant incidents which have a lesson for us are recognized and acknowledged everywhere in China. But everywhere in China you also have local cultures. And when people, if you're listening around, you say you speak Mandarin and you go to Shanghai and you're listening to people in public places, they're speaking Mandarin and so forth, you'll recognize all the sentiments that they're conveying. But if you get two locally born Shanghainese together and they go off into Wu dialect, and you won't understand anything that they're saying, and yet they're laughing and giggling even louder than they were when they were talking in Mandarin, you know that regional identity and the regional, again, I mentioned the term warm fuzzy. There's a warm fuzziness involved in using your own local dialect anywhere in China that is going to be around for a long time. Again, I point, and we talked about this a moment ago, about the importance of maintaining both either or and both and. So the one thing that we should fear most is that that globalization or convergence, a nice word for that that's been around longer than globalization, is convergence. As people come into contact with each other, and people from different places, languages, histories, and so forth, more often their expectations come to coincide, right? But this is not necessarily a bad thing. This happened, all over Europe in what we call the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, but Latin was maintained as the lingua franca, so that people from different languages, geopolitical backgrounds, and so forth, could all communicate with each other if they just learn Latin. Well, this is the situation that you have when you use Mandarin anywhere in China. It's like in the Middle Ages, people could switch to Latin. If you were Spanish and you didn't understand Italian, you could switch to Latin. Or if you didn't understand French, you could switch to Latin. And they can do that in. So I think it's the importance of maintaining both and, while acknowledging the existence. You have choices of either or, but maintain the ability to keep that choice in an increasingly complex and diverse society. The thing that we need to fear more than anything else is the loss of diversity, the lack of diversity that results from convergence. That would be horrible. That would be, to me, that would be horrible, because if you get a physicist to define entropy, entropy is the total absence of energy, because everything is the same. Everything is melded together and there's no difference. When there's no difference, there's no energy. It's lights out, right? So we need to fear the disappearance of difference, but we need to pursue the connection of difference for everybody's advantage. And that's what mutuality of benefit in a system is all about. So you have to both keep either or, because without either or, there is no energy. And both and, because if you have the choices of either or in a diversity of situations, then you have, as long as the solitudes, if you will, are in communication with each other, you have the virtue of difference and the virtue of networked similarity. I've come a long way from TV commercials, haven't I? Oh, Jesus, 3:30.
I had one in the spirit of the last point about diversity.
Yes.
I have one minor difference.
All right.
With comments you've made, and that is you've made a comparison between Chinese culture and what you call Anglo culture. And I agree in general with what you say, but there are diversities within Anglo culture.
Absolutely.
And I would make the point about the difference between English humor and Scottish humor.
Yep.
Now, most people just lump them all together as British. There's a well-known humorist named Alexander McCall Smith, very popular.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about going back and reading his work in London, and people laugh out loud. And he goes back to his home in Edinburgh. He's a Scot. And people don't laugh. Because in Scotland, the tradition is to honor humor, you take time to digest it. It would be rude to just laugh quickly. You want to think about it. You want to think about the intellectual connotation, enjoy it, savor it for a while, and then quietly enjoy it. So, there are differences within Anglo culture as well.
There's differences within Anglo-North American culture. I remind you that I was born and raised in South Carolina, where my first culture, my first Anglo-North American culture was South Carolina culture, if that's not an oxymoron.
I'm sorry to break this up because we're all enjoying it so much. It is my pleasant duty, first of all, to say, Jan, what a great pleasure it is to welcome you back to the forum which you invented, to the David Lamb Center which you founded, and to the university which is still your home, and to thank you for a wonderful presentation today. It was vintage Jan Walls. It was a combination of learning and levity, of weightiness in research and lightness in presentation. I think, it's those contrasts that make it all so vivid. You taught us a lot of things. You taught us the difference between wit and humor. You gave us lots of illustrations of humor. But I think you yourself gave us a wonderful example of wit early on when you pointed out the difference between a byproduct and a byproduct. I mean, that's a very good example of wit. It was wide-ranging. My goodness, you went back to the oldest joke in the world, to modern TV culture. I've never heard the oldest joke in the world before, but I won't forget it now. You gave us vivid illustration. I have to make lots of toast, and I will never again be able to reach for a glass of wine without wondering if you have a nipple on it. So you left us with vivid memories. You stimulated discussion. People don't want to end it, but it has to be ended. I want to I want to thank you very warmly for coming and doing this, and to say not only to thank you, but to express the hope that you'll come back often and do it again. Thanks. And I almost forgot, I have a small gift for you, not so small.
Better not be one of those David Lamb Center ballpoint pens.
What it does is, it is an attempt to show what we think has happened to you in the 2 months since you've left. We think you've gotten more youthful than ever. We hope this fits.
Thank you, Earl. You can go now.